everyone. I think we're now broadcasting live on YouTube from New Networks for Nature. I'll just start again because we might have had a very short delay there. So now I think we're broadcasting live on YouTube from New Networks for Nature. Thanks so much for joining us. Just to say, we actually have never done this before. This is all kind of new to us in terms of the technology. But the way that it's going to work is that I have all the speakers here of the panel on Zoom, and we're going to ask for questions from you on YouTube. So you can type them directly into YouTube. You do have to be signed in, which means you have to have an account, but that can be done, that can be created quite quickly. So we would love to hear from you, and please do give us some questions. I'll just reintroduce the panel. I have here Steve Waters, who is a professor of playwriting and creative writing at the University of East Anglia. My colleague, you'll see those of us from UEA are a bit thick on the ground in this panel. We have also Dr. Rupert Reed, who is a associate professor of philosophy at UEA. The odd man out is James Thornton, who is CEO of Client Earth. James is a lawyer and also an activist, if I could call him that, through the law for the planet. And also we have Rebecca Tillett, who is an associate professor in the School of Arts and American Studies at UEA. And hopefully you'll all have watched our panel, States of Emergency, and you'll be burning with some questions. And I realize now burning is perhaps metaphorically not the thing to say. But I've got a question from Maggie here. And I think I'd like to open with that. And then I've got a big question about recent world events. So Maggie Yaxley Smith, thanks Maggie. She says here, and I'll put this to our panel, I came away from your inspiring panel discussion asking, how can we feel the urgency of and stop the destruction of the earth? Do we need an emergency service as vital as the NHS? For nature, I would assume. Yeah, an excellent question. And actually a really new kind of logistical angle. I haven't seen it proposed like that before. So I wondered, yes, what do our panel think? Could I start with you, Rupert?
Yeah, so my starting point here would be the unique nature of this emergency, which I think renders it not very well suited to the kind of thing actually that Maggie has in mind. We have to take super seriously that this is a long emergency, a very long emergency. So on the one hand, there are many temporal paradoxes here. On the one hand, action is very urgent, but on the other hand, if we don't approach this as a marathon as opposed to a sprint, then we're approaching it in completely the wrong way. We have to think long term. We have to restore long-termism to our paradigm, if you will, and to our modes of governance. We've lost that. If we think in ways which are too sort of panicky in response to the current situation, we will literally move from frying pans to fires. One such panicky mode of response would be to reach immediately for geoengineering or so-called negative emissions technologies. So yeah, my main line in response to this question would be, yep, absolutely, this is an emergency. That's what Extinction Rebellion and the School of Climate Strikers have been so good at getting people to understand. We've had various direct declarations of emergency and so on, but it's a completely different kind of emergency to the emergencies that we're used to. It doesn't feel like an emergency, and in some respects, it has to be responded to very different from the emergencies that we're used to.
Thank you. Thanks, Rupert. James.
I mean, I appreciate the question, and a question that makes you think about things differently is amazingly helpful. And I guess I have two immediate responses, but I'll go away and keep thinking about this one, I think. The first immediate response would be, and it's in line, slightly parallel, but in line with what Rupert was saying. We have the governments all focused on this to one degree or another. And the governments really, if they take it seriously, become our emergency services on this. They are there permanently, and they can address this in both the short and the long-term way that Rupert was talking about. And one of the exciting things that's been happening quite recently is governments in Asia have been taking it very seriously. China saying that it would become carbon neutral before 2060, followed quickly by Japan and then South Korea, and the Philippines promising in the last few weeks to not build any more coal. So you see governments beginning to turn their ships to take care of the problem in a concerted way. And about China, there was an interesting article in the Guardian actually yesterday that the most prominent environmentalist in China, a very good guy I know called Ma Jun, who's been very critical and one of the people turning the culture towards taking care of the environment, said, I believe that the government has completely understood the emergency quality of this, and it's going to put its money where its mouth is. So I think that governments need to turn into that emergency service.
Great, thank you. Steve and Rebecca.
Yeah, Steve. I mean, I think that's a great framing of the discussion. I know what Rupert's saying about bedding in for a much longer struggle, perhaps, than some sort of very swift set of interventions. But I think, on the other hand, I think we have to look at how ill fit for purpose we are. I mean, even with James's encouraging thoughts about what certain governments are doing, it's striking that in this country, look at the relevant departments of government. They're actually some of the minor departments of government, for starters. DEFRA, which is in its very name, tells us where we are going wrong, right? Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, which is essentially the National Farmers Union in power. They are not fit for purpose for addressing some of these questions, and yet they are the go-to organisation that oversees so much conservation in this country, or the lack of conservation in this country. A shocking fact. I've just been reading a great book, Guy Shrubshall's book, Who Owns England, and he calculates that 2% of England is given over to conservation, 2%. 70% is given over to farming. That with those statistics, we won't get very far unless we start to very swiftly address questions of land ownership, land use. Guy Shrubshall talks about a land commission, which is something which Scotland has certainly undertaken. I think that's a matter of incredible urgency, because you start to see this as the end of a very, very long process of land abuse, really. And now it really is becoming chronic. And yet, when you start to look at those stats, you think how quickly those could change. Of course, the other interesting, slightly toothless institution was the Department of Energy and Climate Change, which is, of course, now the Department for Business, Energy and Innovation. So those rebrandings, even of government agencies, have told us why we're looking in the wrong direction. Perhaps actually we're maybe one of the most backward in some of these respects. I remember going to Mongolia a few years ago, where they have a Ministry of Nature. I kind of think we need a Ministry of Nature in this country. So I do think institutions are going to be part of this. So I think the emergency services for nature is a great idea.
Yeah, so thank you. Rebecca.
I was just going to say, what I'm kind of thinking of is it harks back to the panel, what we were discussing in the panel. There is sort of a note of optimism to be seen when you look at Latin America in particular, and you look at the Pachamama laws and the recognition of the earth as a living and sentient being. But I absolutely agree with everyone about the ways in which the government has to take a lead on this, and there has to be legislation. And our institutions aren't really up to scratch on this. So I'm kind of torn between a note of optimism and a note of pessimism on this. I do think that there's some really interesting ways that we can sort of move forwards. But I think what Steve was saying about land ownership is incredibly important. And I have been reading quite a lot about the theft of the commons in recent years. And I do think it's a real issue about how we think about land, because we've had that kind of absolute fracture in a common relationship with the land in the UK. then there is a real issue about how we get back to thinking in kind of symbiotic, related ways about land and land use.
Yeah.
Can I just add one more reflection? Since we did the panel discussion, one of the things that is good about the world is that Donald Trump lost the election in America, even though he hasn't admitted it yet. And Joe Biden genuinely cares about climate change and about nature. And it may be that the government in the UK, which has been, just as everyone is saying, far from a world leader in the last few years in doing something about climate change, will have to take a much more proactive role in order to build bridges with the new president in the United States, who actually does care about this. Biden thinks Brexit was a disaster, and he thinks the special relationship is under threat if the Good Friday Agreement is put in question by the government's policies. So the sweet spot that Boris Johnson could find with the new American president is working on climate change. And since the UK is hosting the global convention on climate change next year, it is in the position where it could do something really great in order to rally the countries to improve their performance and get back to the original question of making them into people, all the people in government focused on an emergency together. So there's a brilliant opportunity that the British government has over the next year.
Yeah, thank you, James. As I mentioned earlier when we were having our private discussion, this was a question I wanted to put, and I very much want to get to the questions in YouTube, and I will, but it seems an opposite moment to ask perhaps others to come into the fact that when we recorded this panel, it was, I think, October 28th. And obviously, things have changed in the United States, and we have an incumbent administration, an incoming administration rather, that is much more positive and friendlier toward our issue of mutual concern. So, what is the forecast then, apart from, I think James has just given a really able political encapsulation of bilateral relations anyway between the UK, but in terms of the states of emergency, the questions on the table, the things that we have to solve very quickly, would anyone else like to come in and comment on the change of administration? Rupert?
Yeah, so my perspective is a little less optimistic than James's. I think it's obvious to anyone with two brain cells to rub together that it's a good thing that Trump lost. But I'm not as delighted that Biden won. If it had been Sanders, say, I'd be considerably more delighted, or even there would be real problems. Why am I saying this? Okay, Biden has signed up to, on paper, quite a radical climate plan, but his priorities are going to be very different. He has been for his whole life a neoliberal politician with roots in the labor movement, and I think he's going to be pursuing vigorous policies of economic growth. I'm reminded of the cautionary tale of the 1990s in the United States, where we had Clinton as a president who was contrasted with the Bush who came before him and the Bush who came after him. But actually, a lot of environmental indicators declined more during the Clinton years than they did in the Bush years. Why? Well, the principal reason was that Clinton was so much more effective in conventional terms at managing the economy, i.e. getting it to grow. And that's the fastest way we get to destroy nature and everything, by getting the economy to grow. So I am very nervous about the Biden administration. I'm especially nervous about the possibility that people might start thinking, oh, well, it's going to be fine now. We've got a Democrat president and he's got a decent climate plan and so on. Everybody needs to be on this from the beginning, absolutely pushing to make sure that the action that takes place in America is as world leading as it can possibly be. And even if it is, it almost certainly won't be enough relative to the issues of nature and climate in the dire situation that they are in. We are going to need much bigger nonviolent direct action movements and so much more if we're going to get through what's coming. So I really hope people are not too over-enthused by the Biden victory. Okay, it's, as I say, 1,000 times better than the alternative, but it's it's still way, way short of where we need to be, in my opinion.
Thank you, Rupert. Rebecca?
Yeah, well, it's a good start. I think it's a good start because at least it isn't Trump. But I absolutely take on board everything that Rupert's saying. A huge amount needs to be done, and the sort of drive to boost the economy will be a huge issue. I suppose in many ways I'm kind of made optimistic by the others who've also been elected. So the range of different candidates that have never been elected before in the US, including peoples of color and also transgender peoples as well. And I'm also buoyed by the news that Biden is thinking of talking about appointing one of a first Indigenous person to his sort of inner circle. And I think that could be really, really interesting. But it is just the first step. And I think we, as Rupert says, we need to be pushing constantly for more to be happening.
Yeah, thank you. I'm just looking through the questions, and I see that there's a couple of questions which are effectively, I'm going to conflate a couple for you. Well, Hugh Braidwood asks, how do you think climate emergency, what should it mean to the standard UK citizen, and how should ordinary citizens, if any of us are ordinary, be encouraged to respond to this? And Andrea Holland has seconded this with an observation that not everyone feels comfortable about talking about or doing direct action, or becoming involved with direct action. So yeah, it's a question which, to an extent, we touched upon in the panel, but I wondered if you had follow-up thoughts about our individual responsibility. So I'll go to Steve first, and then Rupert. Thanks, Steve.
Firstly, I am delighted about the victory of Joe Biden. I just want to say that I'm not yet ready to be sceptical. I will be, and Rupert and Rebecca are right to strike a note of caution. But we've had a narrative of the last few years of the impregnability of right-wing populist regimes, and that has been punctured by the last 7 days or so. So just to respond to that, I feel it's worth saying. Apart from anything else, the role of science and public discourse is returning, and that is highly welcome. And I think that will destabilise this regime in this country too, as we've seen over the last 3 days. The alt-right's grip on power is weakening. I don't think all action is direct action in the way that, say, Extinction Rebellion might characterise it. I think there's a degree to which I think Extinction Rebellion's methodology is extraordinary. And obviously, having chatted to Rupert about it, I know that in a way there's an optimistic idea behind it, that it is a mass mobilisation of citizen resistance that ultimately clogs the kind of function of everyday life. And I don't think that has happened, and I suspect that may not happen. And there's a degree to which the pandemic has definitely we've all taken a hit in terms of our muscles of activism and our capacity to do pretty much anything other than go for a walk for 20 minutes. So, we're not good to go for a mass campaign at the moment. But it seems to me that one of the great promises of ecological thinking from the word go is the individual is central to it. And clearly that is right down to every single decision that we take every second of the day. Those are quite overwhelming ethical responsibilities that we carry forward upon ourselves. But I think that the state of emergency means that nothing can anymore be taken for granted. And that kind of vigilance about behaviour is no longer a sort of Sunday supplement, sort of pull out. I think now, part of our jobs as storytellers and thinkers and activists is to sort of offer narratives of everyday change. I mean, one of the reasons I want to work in quite a parochial set of contexts, which are literally within sort of 15 miles of where I live or 50 miles, is I want to sort of, if you like, bring that revolution right to our doorsteps culturally and in terms of our practice, and just really celebrate and transform the immediate sphere that we're in. And I think that is, that's been the long-term promise of ecological activism, I think, but now its time has really arrived. And I think the pandemic and our behavioural patterns during the pandemic have made that even more explicit to us than ever before. So I salute particular forms of direct action, but I think there's other, direct action can be understood in a range of ways, I think.
Thank you, Steve. Rupert.
Yeah, so what needs to happen in response to the climate and environment emergency? Well, everything needs to change. How do we get that to start happening? I want to highlight two things. One is that I think that people need to get a lot more serious about organizing in their communities, and that follows nicely from what Steve has just said. And that should include, by the way, a willingness where necessary to engage in nonviolent direct action. So look at the Transition Towns movement, for example. Wonderful movement, it's achieved lots of good stuff. But over and over again, transition towns have run into points at which the law or regulations and so on don't allow them to do obvious good things that they want to do. Well, I think it's time that we started saying, let's not take no for an answer any longer. When we're trying to defend our children, defend our future food supply, make our communities resilient, etc., we need to be willing to go one step beyond what our local authorities, let alone central government, just so far behind the times, are willing to do. And the second thing I want to say is to underscore, we are going to need civil disobedience, nonviolent direct action at multiple levels. We're going to need it nationally. We're going to need it internationally. We're going to need it on a far greater scale than Extinction Rebellion has brought to the table. And this is what I'm calling for in my new book coming out in January, Parents for a Future, it's called. I'm calling up for a mass mobilization of parents, of those who are most responsible for the next generation and who can no longer defend the next generation by just putting them into a good school and so on. We have to do it together. We have to change the system. And I'm calling in that book for a far larger nonviolent uprising than we've seen so far. And in response to the question which says, well, look, some of us aren't comfortable engaging in that, my response is that's totally fine. Do whatever you can. But in particular, please do support those who are capable of doing it. Do support those who are willing to do it. We know that for successful nonviolent direct action, for every one person who's willing to be arrested, you need about 5 or even 10 people who are in support of them, whether that be money, emotional support, or just general solidarity. That we're going to absolutely need that if we're going to tackle these emergencies adequately, if we're going to move the dial much further than it's already been moved.
Okay, thank you, Rupert. Would anyone else like to respond to you, James?
May I add? Yeah, so I think these are all wonderful ideas, and they illustrate for me that everybody has a role to play. So the main thing I think in response to the emergency is that one can say to oneself, what's my role and what can I do this day, this week, this month, and empower yourself to think correctly that there is something you can do, which may be to tell a story to your kid, or if you're a kid, it may be to challenge your parents, or it may be to strike. I mean, I use law disruptively. I sue governments, for example, and force things to change and write new laws to make things go the right way. It's a different way of causing disruption. I mean, one that I was talking with people about the other day, which is very helpful, very disruptive, and very something you can do from the comfort of your home, is to, if you're a member of a pension fund, is to go to the pension fund, write to the pension fund and say, is my money making climate change worse, or is it making climate change better? And a mass movement of people demanding that pension funds actually spend money in a way that reduces climate change is another very powerful, very disruptive, excellent political thing that everybody who is a member of a pension fund can do. So I think the main thing is to say, what can I do? And there's an answer for everyone every day.
Yeah, thank you. Rebecca.
Yeah, there was kind of 2 points that I wanted to make. The first is that one of the most dangerous stories that we tell ourselves is that we individually cannot make a difference. And we need to change that kind of narrative. I suppose one of the ways in which we can start thinking about that is how can we make a difference, and how can we change our thinking? So one of the key ideas that comes through in the work that I've been doing with Indigenous writing and Indigenous thinking is understanding notions of obligation. And that's a key central tenet of Indigenous thinking, the fact that your relationship to everything else on this planet, everyone else on this planet, is one of obligation. And clearly that's something that is completely negated by the ways in which capitalist societies work. I mean, capitalism absolutely refuses to recognize any sense of obligation at all. And if we were to think about the kind of the dictionary definition of obligation, then we're thinking about moral and even legal responsibilities and duties. And if we were to think about the natural world in that way, if we were to try and start thinking in different ways, then I think we would start, it would be more of a story of hope, I think, than of hopelessness. And the story that we cannot have make a difference in any way is a story of incredible hopelessness. And it is something that actually stops people from having the ability to take any action. It kind of numbs you mentally and emotionally before you even get started. So yeah, I think obligation, centering obligation in the ways in which we think could be a really interesting way of thinking forwards.
Yeah, absolutely. And it just occurred to me as you were speaking that there is freedom in obligation. It isn't just kind of assuming a mantle of responsibility, which is ultimately confining, but it is what it allows us to be real human beings and to participate in a collective. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's many great questions coming in. One question that I have, which again I'm going to conflate two, is about James's work specifically in reconfiguring, reconstituting, re-narrativizing the law so that Earth and its life systems, including human communities, can be seen as the title holders of legal rights. And obviously that's incredibly important work that you've been doing, James, but it's also a broader question for everyone about the level of, about the ability of internationalism, another question, the potential for supra-governmental or supranational structures and ways of being to help us tackle climate change. It would seem that this is necessary. What would people like to comment about that? James, perhaps you, in terms of your work
yes.
with governments around the world, is there a level of international, again, supranational cooperation?
Yes, well, there is, and a lot of this happens quite invisibly because it's not interesting to the press. And anything that governments do that's cooperative and pleasant doesn't get to be seen very much. But there are a lot of governments. So the Paris Agreement hasn't yet delivered an end to emergency, but it is a remarkable achievement of the human spirit in getting all of the governments of the world just about to agree that they need to act. And the next meeting is in the UK next year, when all governments come together to present their plans as to how they're going to radicalize their own action. Now, that's a wonderful global story, and it is a cooperative story. And China is saying we're going to speed up. Japan, South Korea, Philippines. We'll see that from America that will rejoin. That is an overarching global framework of governance that can help deliver an end to this. At the same time, there's one on nature, the Convention on Biological Diversity, a global agreement. It hasn't stopped the destruction of nature, but there's an opportunity next year when all the world gets together again to revise the agreement, to understand what's been going on, that the current methods haven't protected the natural world, and to come up with essentially a Paris Agreement for nature. So these two great overarching agreements are both up for major reworking next year. And from what I get from governments, both on climate and on nature, there is much positive that can be done. If everyone marched in the streets, as Rupert is suggesting, between now and then, it would certainly help.
Yes, Rupert.
Yeah, and obviously I think we should do that. And it's especially, of course, a huge opportunity that the climate COP is going to be here in the UK. And, everybody watching this should be thinking, all right, how can I work towards that? The whole world's eyes are going to be on the UK over the next year on this absolutely vital issue. This is a now or never moment. But again, I must say I'm a little less optimistic than James. My view is that it is bound to be the case that the climate COP next year essentially fails. By that I mean either that it won't achieve a meaningful agreement at all, or that it will, which is quite likely, but the agreement will be inadequate in the same kind of ways that the Paris Agreement is patently inadequate. It's a recipe for 3 to 4 degrees of global overheat, which means civilizational breakdown. So what should we do? Well, we should press for it to be less inadequate, but there's something else. We should be open now about the fact that it's heading for failure. It's no good, it seems to me, as we move into this new emergency phase of the climate and nature situation, to carry on saying, oh, we need to do better, we need to try harder. We need to be saying openly, we are on course to fail catastrophically. There needs to be a step change. And one of the implications of this from an activist point of view, it seems to me, is that activists ought to be campaigning not just for the COP agreements to be better, but they ought to be campaigning in regard to the likelihood that they're going to essentially not be good enough. In other words, for me, the most important date of next year's calendar, the most important date of all, is the day after the climate COP. That's the date when we should have millions in the streets saying it is a disgrace that you have failed to protect our children. And that kind of upsurge of rage, frankly, as well as love, could be truly game-changing.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I mean, Steve, yes, I can take a quick comment and then we'll have to...
Oh, just very quickly, I think one thing that's going to be crucial is to release conservation from nationalist discourse a little bit. I think we tend to think of, you know, if you look at our major institutions, the National Trust, the Royal Society for Protection of Birds, even in, again, their title, they, if you like, delimit themselves, even though they take international action, to the realm. Brexit is going to kind of create a completely new context for the way we relate to the natural world, both here and beyond the UK. And one of the things I think is really crucial is to release habitats from national narratives. You know, when I think about reed beds, I will be thinking about them in the light of the Ramsar Convention, which was signed, you know, on the south of the Caspian Sea in northern Iran, and in a way that's as relevant as the fact that, you know, we venerate the Norfolk Broads or whatever it is. So we've got to start conceiving of our landscapes and our habitats and our wildlife as the global commons and start really finding tough measures to kind of reach across the world to protect and sort of consolidate our reaction to the collapse of their populations.
Yes, thank you, everybody. There's some fantastic questions coming through, but I'm afraid we've run out of time and that we have to prepare for our next event. So we thank you very much for attending, for your questions, which we'll have a record of, and I'll pass them to the panel members so they know what's been proposed. And thank you so much, and we'll see you very soon indeed. In fact, in about 12 minutes for Kathleen, Jamie, and Tim D. Thank you so much to my panel for coming back on this gloomy but ultimately hopeful and positive November afternoon. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thanks, Jean. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah,
thank you very much.